Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. This helps YouTube show you more chilling stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been hauling freight across this country for 15 years. I've seen everything the road has to offer: blizzards that turn highways into ice rinks, dust storms that swallow entire convoys, and deadlines that push you past the edge of exhaustion. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Interstate 80 through Nevada last month. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday when I first noticed the headlights in my mirrors. I was running a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver, making good time through the desert stretch where civilization disappears for hundreds of miles. The CB had been quiet for the last hour. Just me and a couple other night owls scattered across the wasteland, checking in every now and then to break the monotony. "Eastbound mile marker 187, I'd called out earlier. "Anyone else fighting to stay awake out here?" A driver hauling livestock had responded from about 50 miles ahead, complained about his cargo getting restless. That was the last normal conversation I'd have for a while. The headlights appeared suddenly in my passenger side mirror, perfectly aligned with my trailer. At first, I didn't think much of it. Truckers often travel in loose convoys for safety and company, especially through desolate stretches like this. But as the miles rolled by, something started eating at me. The rig behind me wasn't just following. It was matching my exact speed, maintaining the precise distance between us no matter what I did. When I eased off the throttle going up grades, it slowed. When I picked up speed on the downhill, it accelerated. The spacing never changed, not by a single foot. I tried the CB. "Northbound Peterbilt, this is the Kenworth ahead of you, come back." Static. I tried again, switching channels. "Any driver behind the white Kenworth at mile 195 you got your ears on?" Nothing but the empty hiss of dead air. The headlights stayed there, burning steady in my mirrors like twin stars that refused to move across the sky. I started paying closer attention, squinting into the reflection. The lights seemed wrong somehow. Too yellow, too dim for modern LED arrays. They had that old tungsten glow I remembered from rigs back in the 80s. By mile marker 200, my unease had shifted into something deeper. I decided to test my shadow. I signaled right and moved into the hammer lane to pass a slower vehicle that wasn't there. Just wanted to see what would happen. The phantom rig followed, matching my lane change perfectly, maintaining that exact same distance. I moved back to the right. It moved back. I tried a third lane change, then a fourth. Each time, those yellow headlights tracked my movement with mechanical precision, like they were tethered to my trailer by an invisible chain. The next test was speed. I gradually increased from 65 to 70, then 75. The headlights stayed locked in position. I backed down to 55, watching my speedometer needle drop while keeping one eye on the mirror. Still there. Still perfectly spaced. It was like looking at my own reflection, except the reflection was driving an entirely different truck. My hands started sweating on the steering wheel. I'd been driving long enough to know when something was seriously wrong, and this was pinging every alarm bell in my head. At mile marker 220, I saw the exit sign for a truck stop I knew well. Dusty's Desert Oasis, a 24-hour joint with decent coffee and clean showers. I needed to get a look at this other driver. Needed to understand what game he was playing. I took the exit without signaling, watching the mirror intently. The phantom rig followed, smooth as silk, taking the curve exactly as I did. But as we rolled into the truck stop parking lot, I felt my blood turn to ice water. There were only 3 other trucks parked there, all dark and silent. No space where my follower could park, no driver climbing down from a cab. I pulled into a spot under the bright security lights and set my air brakes with a sharp hiss. The phantom rig pulled into the space directly behind me, close enough that I should have been able to see its front grille in my mirrors. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down, heart hammering against my ribs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the parked trucks. I walked around to the back of my trailer, flashlight beam cutting through the desert air. Nothing. Empty asphalt stretched behind my rig. I spun in a circle, scanning the entire lot. 3 trucks, all accounted for, all belonging to drivers who were probably sleeping in their bunks. No phantom rig, no driver, no explanation for the headlights that had been locked onto my mirrors for the past 40 miles. I stood there for 10 minutes, playing the beam of my flashlight across every inch of pavement, looking for tire tracks, oil stains, anything that might prove another truck had been there. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the dust beside my trailer, there were tire tracks, not from my rig, but from something older, wider. The tread pattern was wrong, too deep and too aggressive for modern highway tires. I knelt down and ran my fingers through the impressions. They were warm, as if the rubber that made them had just rolled through. But they ended abruptly about 10 feet behind my trailer, like the truck that made them had simply vanished into thin air. I went into the truck stop and bought coffee with shaking hands. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, asked if I was all right. "Seen anything strange out there tonight?" I asked her. She shook her head, but something flickered in her eyes. What kind of strange? I described the phantom rig, the headlights that wouldn't break formation, the tire tracks that ended nowhere. She was quiet for a long moment, then leaned across the counter. "You're not the first driver to mention something like that," she whispered. "Couple months ago, a driver came in here white as a sheet, talking about an old rig that followed him for 60 miles. Said when he finally got a look at it up close, the driver was..." She shuddered. "Well, let's just say the driver couldn't have been driving anything anywhere." I finished my coffee in silence and walked back to my truck. The tire tracks were still there, still warm to the touch. I fired up my engine and pulled back onto the interstate, checking my mirrors obsessively. The road stretched empty behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the darkness, an old rig with yellow headlights was still maintaining the perfect distance, still matching my every move. Even now, weeks later, I find myself glancing at my mirrors more than I should, watching for headlights that follow too close and drivers who might not be entirely alive. Some roads have memories and some memories never rest. I'm Maria Santos, and I've been running independent freight for 8 years now. When you're an owner-operator, you take whatever loads pay the bills, even the odd ones that make you scratch your head. But the delivery I took 3 weeks ago in rural Montana still haunts me, and I'm starting to think some jobs are too strange to be worth any amount of money. The manifest came through my broker on a Thursday afternoon. Simple enough. Pick up a mixed load of furniture and personal items from an estate sale company in Billings, deliver to a residential address outside Glacier National Park. The pay was unusually good for such a short haul, nearly double the going rate, which should have been my first warning. But I'd had a slow month and my truck payment was due. I loaded up without asking too many questions. The cargo was strange from the start. Instead of the usual modern furniture you'd expect from an estate sale, everything looked like it belonged in a museum. There were hand-carved rocking chairs with intricate designs, a massive oak dining table that took 4 men to load, and trunk after trunk of what felt like clothing and books. The estate sale manager, a nervous man who wouldn't make eye contact, kept checking his watch and insisting I needed to deliver everything before sunset. "The family is very particular about timing," he said, handing me the delivery address scrawled on a piece of paper that looked decades old. I punched the address into my GPS as I pulled out of Billings. 1847 Whitefish Creek Road, Glacier County. The device calculated the route without issue. About 3 hours through increasingly remote mountain roads. The drive started normal enough, winding through pine forests and past crystal-clear streams. But as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, my GPS started acting up. The route kept recalculating, sending me down narrower and narrower back roads that didn't seem to exist on any map. By the time I reached what should have been Whitefish Creek Road, I was driving on a dirt track barely wide enough for my rig. The GPS was insisting I'd reached my destination, but all I could see was an empty meadow surrounded by towering pines. No house, no mailbox, no sign of human habitation anywhere. I pulled over and climbed down, thinking maybe I'd missed a driveway. That's when I saw the foundation. Hidden by tall grass and scattered wildflowers, the concrete outline of what had once been a large house stretched across the meadow. I walked the perimeter, my boots crunching on broken glass and charred wood fragments that poked through the soil. This wasn't recent damage. Whatever had happened here, it had been years, maybe decades ago. I pulled out my phone to call the broker, but had no signal this deep in the mountains. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do, I noticed an old pickup truck coming up the dirt road, dust trailing behind it. The driver was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes. She rolled down her window as I approached. "You lost, honey?" she asked. I explained about the delivery, showed her the address. Her face went pale. 1847 Whitefish Creek Road, she repeated slowly. "Lord have mercy, you don't know, do you?" She told me the story as evening shadows crept across the meadow. 37 years ago, the Morrison family had lived in a beautiful log home on this exact spot. Parents, 3 children, grandmother, a family of 6 who kept to themselves but were well liked in the community. One winter night, a chimney fire had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time the volunteer fire department reached them traveling these same narrow roads I'd just navigated, the entire house was engulfed. No survivors. The strange thing, the woman continued, was that they never found all the bodies. Some folks said the family had visitors that night, relatives from back east who were never accounted for. But the fire was so intense, so complete, that there wasn't much left to investigate. The county condemned the property and eventually the Forest Service claimed it. Nobody's lived here since. I thanked her and she drove away, but her story left me more confused than before. I walked back to my trailer, planning to call my broker once I found cell service and explain the situation. But when I opened the trailer doors, my blood ran cold. The cargo had changed. Gone were the estate sale furniture and trunks. Instead, the trailer was packed with personal belongings that looked like they'd been hastily gathered during an emergency. Children's toys, photo albums, a grandmother's quilt still folded neatly in a cedar chest. Everything smelled faintly of smoke. I grabbed the manifest from my cab with trembling hands. The writing had changed too. Instead of the typed delivery instructions, the paper now showed handwritten notes in faded ink. Personal effects of the Morrison family. Final delivery to 1847 Whitefish Creek Road. Please handle with care. These are all we have left. At the bottom, signed in a shaky hand, Robert Morrison, Sarah Morrison, Grace Morrison, Tommy Morrison, Jessica Morrison, and Grandma Rose. As darkness settled over the meadow, I heard voices carrying on the evening breeze. Soft conversations, children laughing, someone calling for dinner. I looked toward the foundation and saw them, translucent figures moving around the concrete outline as if the house still stood. A man in work clothes, a woman in a faded dress, 3 children of various ages, and an elderly woman in a rocking chair that looked exactly like one I'd loaded that morning. They saw me watching and approached slowly, their forms becoming clearer as they drew near. The man spoke first, his voice echoing strangely in the mountain air. "We've been waiting so long for our things to come home," he said. "Thank you for bringing them back to us." One by one, they began unloading the trailer, carrying their belongings back to the foundation where their house had once stood. I should have been terrified, should have run, but there was nothing threatening about them. They were just a family, grateful to have their possessions returned after decades of separation. The children were excited about their toys. The grandmother clutched her quilt with obvious relief, and the parents carefully carried photo albums and family heirlooms. As they worked, they told me about their lives, their plans for the house, their dreams that had been cut short by flames and smoke. They spoke of the visitors who had arrived that snowy night, family members driving from hundreds of miles away for a reunion that became their final gathering. When the trailer was empty, Robert Morrison shook my hand with fingers that felt like cool air. "The manifest should show delivery complete now," he said with a sad smile. "You won't be bothered by any brokers about this load." As dawn broke over the mountains, the family faded away, leaving only the concrete foundation and wildflowers swaying in the morning breeze. I drove back to Billings in a daze, expecting angry calls about the missing cargo. But when I checked my delivery records, there was no trace of the Morrison job. No manifest, no payment pending, no broker contact. It was as if the delivery had never existed. The only proof I have is the memory of that night and the faint smell of smoke that still clings to my trailer, reminding me that some deliveries transcend the boundaries between the living and the dead. Even now, I occasionally get calls for deliveries to addresses that don't quite exist, with cargo manifests written in handwriting that looks decades old. I turn them down. Some jobs are meant for drivers who understand that not every road leads to the land of the living, and not every delivery has a destination you can find on any map. My name is Tommy Chen, and I've only been driving truck for 6 months. Fresh out of CDL school, still learning the ropes, still making rookie mistakes that seasoned drivers shake their heads at. But what happened to me on Route 50 in Nevada, the so-called loneliest road in America, taught me that some lessons can't be found in any manual and some encounters change you forever. It was my 3rd solo run, hauling auto parts from Reno to Denver. I'd been pushing hard, trying to make good time and prove to my dispatcher that I could handle the long hauls without babysitting. By the time I hit the Nevada desert, it was past midnight, and my fuel gauge was dancing dangerously close to empty. Route 50 through central Nevada is no joke. Gas stations are spread thin, and running out of diesel in the middle of nowhere can end a career before it starts. That's when I saw the truck stop appear in my headlights like a mirage made real. The sign read, Desert Rose Travel Plaza, and it looked like it had been there forever. Classic neon signage, the kind they don't make anymore, with a flickering rose that cast pink and red shadows across the parking lot. Most importantly, it was open. The lights were on, the diesel pump stood ready, and I could see the glow of the convenience store through plate glass windows. I pulled up to pump number 3, the one furthest from the building where the light was steadiest. As I climbed down from my cab, I noticed how quiet everything was. No other trucks, no cars, just the hum of electrical equipment and the distant whisper of desert wind. The silence felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like I was deep underwater. I started the fuel flowing and walked around to check my tires, trying to shake off the unease that was settling over me like a cold blanket. That's when I saw her. Standing just at the edge of the pump light's reach, where the bright circle met the desert darkness, was a woman in a dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. The fabric was pale blue with tiny flowers, the kind of pattern my grandmother might have worn to church. Her hair was styled in victory rolls that caught the fluorescent glow, and her lipstick was dark red, almost black in the strange lighting. She was beautiful, but there was something timeless about her beauty, as if she'd stepped out of an old photograph. "You need to be careful tonight," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the empty lot despite the distance between us. "There's going to be an accident up ahead. Around mile marker 267, big pileup. You'll want to slow down when you get there." I looked around wondering if she was talking to someone else, but we were completely alone. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Did you say something about an accident?" I called back. She stepped closer and I could see her more clearly. Her skin had an odd, translucent quality and her eyes seemed much older than her face. "3 cars and a semi," she continued as if we'd been having this conversation for a while. "The trucker falls asleep, crosses the median around 3:15 a.m. The cars don't see him coming until it's too late. Terrible thing. But you can avoid it if you're careful, if you slow down and stay alert." The fuel pump clicked off behind me, but I barely noticed. Something about this woman's certainty, the way she spoke about future events like they were historical facts, made my skin crawl. "How could you possibly know that?" I asked, walking toward her. She smiled, and it was the saddest expression I'd ever seen. "I've been watching this stretch of road for a very long time, honey. I've seen what happens when drivers get tired, when they push too hard. I try to warn the ones I can." As I got closer, I realized I could see the desert landscape through her, as if she was made of morning mist. "I should go," she said, already beginning to fade. "Just remember, mile marker 267 around 3:15. Slow down, stay awake, and you'll make it home safe." I reached out to touch her arm, but my hand passed through empty air. She was gone, leaving only the smell of old perfume and the faintest echo of her voice on the desert wind. I stood there for several minutes, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I'd been hallucinating from exhaustion. Road fatigue could cause all sorts of weird visions, couldn't it? But her warning felt too specific, too urgent to dismiss. I topped off my tank, paid inside to a clerk who seemed surprised to see a customer, and got back on the road. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. as I approached mile marker 260. I found myself unconsciously slowing down, checking my mirrors, scanning the road ahead with unusual intensity. Mile marker 263. Mile marker 265. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. At exactly 3:14 a.m., I crested a small hill and saw mile marker 267 in my headlights. I'd already reduced my speed to about 45 miles per hour, much slower than normal for this stretch. That's when I saw the eastbound semi in the distance, weaving slightly in its lane. Even from half a mile away, I could tell the driver was fighting sleep, the truck drifting toward the median in that telltale pattern every trucker recognizes. I grabbed my CB radio. "Eastbound semi approaching mile 267, wake up driver, you're drifting toward the median." No response. The truck continued its dangerous weaving, now crossing the center line. I hit my air horn and flashed my high beams, anything to get the other driver's attention. Finally, I saw brake lights flare as the other trucker snapped awake and corrected his drift. But the real shock came from behind him. 3 cars traveling close together in the pre-dawn darkness suddenly became visible as they created the same hill. If that semi had crossed the median when it was supposed to, when the woman had predicted it would, those cars would have had no time to react. The pileup would have been exactly as she described. 3 cars and a semi around mile marker 267 at 3:15 a.m. I pulled over at the next truck stop, hands shaking too hard to drive safely. I needed coffee, needed time to process what had just happened. As I walked toward the building, I asked the clerk about the Desert Rose Travel Plaza. "Never heard of it," he said, looking at me strangely. "There's no truck stop between here and Austin. This is the only fuel for 60 miles in either direction." I drove back the next day during daylight, retracing my route exactly. At the spot where the Desert Rose should have been, I found only a concrete foundation overgrown with desert brush and a rusted sign lying face down in the sand. When I turned it over, I could just make out the faded words: Desert Rose Travel Plaza, established 1952. Below that, in smaller text that was barely legible: "In memory of Rose Martinez, 1923 to 1957, beloved wife and mother." I did some research when I got home. Rose Martinez had died in a car accident on Route 50 in 1957, driving home from her job at the Desert Rose after working the late shift. She'd fallen asleep at the wheel around mile marker 267 and crossed into oncoming traffic. The truck stop closed permanently after her death. Her husband couldn't bear to keep it running without her. Since that night, I've heard other drivers mention seeing a woman in vintage clothing near abandoned truck stops, always warning them about accidents that haven't happened yet. They call her the guardian of the loneliest road, a spirit who's dedicated her afterlife to preventing the kind of tragedy that claimed her own life. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that Rose Martinez saved lives that night, mine included. Every time I drive Route 50 now, I slow down around mile marker 267 and I keep a picture of Rose that I found in an old newspaper archive tucked into my visor. Sometimes, on the loneliest nights, I think I catch a glimpse of pale blue fabric in my peripheral vision, and I know she's still out there, still watching over drivers who are too tired and too stubborn to know they need watching over. She may be gone, but she's never really left that stretch of desert highway, and honestly, I'm grateful for that. The road is dangerous enough without losing the angels who guard it. I'm Rex Williams, but everyone on the CB calls me Big Rig. I've been trucking for 22 years, and in that time I've collected more radio equipment than most amateur operators dream of. My Kenworth has 3 different CB radios, a police scanner, a ham radio setup, and even an old shortwave receiver I picked up at a swap meet. The desert highways get lonely, and voices in the static help pass the time. But sometimes you tune into frequencies that were meant to stay buried. It happened on Interstate 40 through Arizona, somewhere between Flagstaff and Winslow, in that endless stretch where the painted desert meets the sky. I was running a load of construction equipment to Albuquerque, making good time in the pre-dawn hours when traffic was light and the road belonged to truckers like me. My main CB was tuned to Channel 19. Monitoring the usual chatter between drivers when I started picking up something strange on the upper channels. At first, it sounded like atmospheric skip, those weird long-distance signals that bounce off the ionosphere during certain weather conditions. But as I fine-tuned the squelch, I realized someone was broadcasting coordinates. Not the usual trucking chatter about speed traps or good fuel prices, but precise GPS coordinates followed by what sounded like radio checks. 39.2904 north, 111.0937 west. Radio check over. The voice was clear, professional, like military or emergency services. I grabbed my atlas and plotted the coordinates. They placed the transmission somewhere in central Utah, hundreds of miles from my current position. That didn't make sense for line-of-sight radio, but skip conditions can be unpredictable. What bothered me was the repetitive nature of the broadcasts. Every 15 minutes, same coordinates, same radio check. I've been around radio long enough to know that legitimate services don't operate like that. Out of curiosity, I plotted my own position and compared it to the coordinates being broadcast. I was at 35.0844 north, 110.7028 west, Mile marker 233 on Interstate 40. The voice came back, 35.0844 north, 110.7028 west. Vehicle identification Kenworth T680, driver designation Big Rig. Maintain current heading, over. My blood went cold. I hadn't transmitted my location to anyone. Hell, I hadn't transmitted anything at all. I was just listening. I keyed the mic with shaking fingers. Unknown station, this is Big Rig. How do you have my coordinates? Please identify yourself, over. Static filled the cab, then, Big Rig, maintain radio silence. You are approaching designated coordinates, ETA 12 minutes. I looked at my speedometer, calculated my position. In 12 minutes, I'd be at mile marker 245. I grabbed my CB and tried channel 19. Any drivers eastbound on 40, this is Big Rig at mile 233. Anyone else picking up weird transmissions on the upper channels? Dead silence, not even static. I switched to my backup radio, tried different channels. Nothing. It was as if every other radio in a 100-mile radius had gone dead, but the mysterious voice continued its countdown on the upper frequency. Big Rig, ETA 9 minutes to coordinates. Prepare for extraction protocol. Extraction? What the hell was extraction protocol? I started looking for an exit anywhere I could get off the interstate and figure out what was happening. But this stretch of Interstate 40 is notorious for long gaps between exits. Nothing but desert and rock formations for miles in either direction. The voice continued, Big Rig, ETA 6 minutes, maintain speed 65 miles per hour. Do not deviate from current trajectory. That's when I realized I was doing exactly 65 miles per hour and I couldn't remember setting my cruise control. I tried to slow down, but my foot wouldn't respond. I tried to steer toward the shoulder, but the wheel felt locked in position. My truck was driving itself, following commands from a voice that shouldn't know my location, shouldn't know my call sign, shouldn't even exist. Big Rig, ETA 3 minutes, visual contact established. I scanned the horizon frantically, looking for aircraft, other vehicles, anything that might explain the surveillance. The desert stretched empty in all directions, broken only by the ribbon of asphalt and the occasional Joshua tree. But as I crested a small rise, I saw it, mile marker 245, exactly where the voice had predicted I'd be. And beside the marker, twisted metal and scattered debris that looked like the remains of a massive vehicle accident. Big Rig, you are now at designated coordinates. Please exit your vehicle and approach the wreckage. The voice had changed, become more urgent, almost pleading. Time is critical. The accident occurred at 03:47 hours. You have approximately 4 minutes before the fuel ignites. I looked at my clock, 3:43 a.m. In 4 minutes, it would be exactly 3:47. I slammed on the brakes, and suddenly I had control of my truck again. The CB crackled. Big Rig, please respond. We can see you at the accident site. The fuel leak is getting worse. You need to get out of the cab before the explosion. I stared at the wreckage beside mile marker 245, and with growing horror, I realized what I was looking at. The twisted metal wasn't old debris. It was fresh, recent, and part of it was the distinctive grille and hood of a Kenworth T680. My Kenworth T680. I looked at my hands, solid and real on the steering wheel. Looked at my CB radio, still crackling with the urgent voice. Big Rig, respond immediately. The fire is spreading. You have less than 2 minutes. But I wasn't in any wreckage. I was sitting in my cab, safe and whole, watching the scene from the highway. Unless... The voice came through one final time, clearer than before. Rex Williams, driver designation Big Rig, time of death 0347 hours, Interstate 40 mile marker 245. Vehicle explosion due to fuel leak ignition. Rex, you've been trying to call for help on the radio for the past hour, but you died in the crash. We've been monitoring your emergency broadcasts. It's time to let go. I looked down at my hands again, and they were flickering like a bad television signal. The cab around me wavered, becoming transparent. Through the fading dashboard, I could see the real scene, my truck on its side engulfed in flames that had been burning for an hour. Emergency vehicles surrounded the wreckage, their red and blue lights painting the desert in colors that matched the sunrise. Big Rig, do you copy? It's okay to let go now. The accident investigation team has everything they need. Your family has been notified. You don't have to keep calling for help that already came too late. I keyed the mic one last time, my voice echoing strangely in the static. This is Big Rig. Message received and understood. Going off the air. The radio went silent. The cab dissolved completely, and I found myself standing beside the wreckage, watching paramedics cover a shape that had once been me with a yellow tarp. A state trooper was shaking his head, explaining to someone on his radio how the driver must have fallen asleep, how the truck had rolled 3 times before catching fire, how there had been no survivors. But he was wrong about that last part. I hadn't survived, but I hadn't left either. I stood there in the growing daylight, watching them load my body into an ambulance, listening to their radios crackle with routine traffic. And I understood, finally, why the coordinates had been so precise, why the voice had known my location so exactly. Because somewhere in that hour between death and acceptance, I had been broadcasting my own position, calling for help on frequencies that only the dead could hear. I still monitor those frequencies sometimes in whatever form of existence this is. And when I hear other drivers calling for help that will never come, broadcasting coordinates from accident scenes they can't admit they'll never leave, I try to guide them through that final transmission, the one that lets them power down their radios and walk away from the static that connects the living and the dead. The road continues, but some journeys end at mile markers you never see coming. And sometimes the voice guiding you through the static is your own. Exit ramp to the afterlife. My name is Sarah Mackenzie, and I drive team with my husband Tom. We've been running coast-to-coast loads together for 12 years, switching off every 4 hours so we can keep the wheels turning around the clock. It's a good system. One drives while the other sleeps in the bunk, and we make better time than solo drivers ever could. But what happened to us on Interstate 84 through Oregon changed everything I thought I knew about the roads we travel and the destinations they lead to. We were hauling electronics from Seattle to Atlanta, running hard to beat a delivery deadline that would net us a substantial bonus. Tom had been driving through the afternoon, and I'd taken over around midnight for my shift through the Blue Mountains. He was sound asleep in the bunk behind me, exhausted from fighting mountain grades and tourist traffic earlier in the day. The interstate was nearly empty at that hour, just me and the occasional westbound trucker passing in the night. I was making good time through a particularly desolate stretch when I noticed an exit sign that didn't look right. It appeared in my headlights like any other green highway sign, but instead of showing a town name or route number, it simply read Rest Area Next Exit. That wasn't unusual by itself. Oregon has plenty of remote rest stops for tired drivers. But something about the sign bothered me. The lettering looked older, the retro-reflective material dulled with age, and the metal showed rust stains that seemed too extensive for a maintained highway sign. I almost drove past it. My fuel was good, I wasn't tired, and we were making excellent time. But as I approached the off-ramp, I felt an inexplicable urge to take the exit. Maybe it was trucker's intuition, that sixth sense that tells you when to stop even when everything seems fine. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that wanted me to see what lay beyond that unmarked exit ramp. The ramp curved gently to the right, descending through a grove of old-growth pines that seemed to swallow my headlights. The road surface was different here. Not the usual concrete or asphalt, but something that looked almost hand-laid, with individual stones fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle. My tires hummed differently on this surface, creating a musical tone that rose and fell with my speed. After about a mile, the trees opened up to reveal what looked like a small town straight out of the 1950s. Main Street was lined with vintage diners, motor lodges, and service stations, all lit by neon signs that cast rainbow reflections on chrome bumpers and white-walled tires. But it wasn't just the buildings that looked vintage. The vehicles did too. Dozens of trucks from different eras were parked along the street. Long-nosed Peterbilts from the 70s, classic Kenworths with sleeper cabs that looked like aluminum igloos, even some old Max and Whites from the 60s that I'd only seen in trucking museums. I parked between a pristine 1973 Freightliner and a gorgeous 1969 Peterbilt 359 with enough chrome to blind an aircraft pilot. As I climbed down from my cab, I could hear music drifting from the diner. Not modern country or rock, but the kind of big band music my grandfather used to play. The whole scene felt dreamlike, too perfect and too detailed to be real, but too consistent to be a hallucination. Inside the diner, I found exactly what I expected and nothing I could have prepared for. The place was packed with truckers, but they were dressed in clothes from different decades. Some wore the polyester shirts and wide ties of the 70s, others had on the work clothes and suspenders of earlier eras. A few looked like they'd stepped out of the 1940s, with their hair pomaded and their boots polished to a mirror shine. They all looked up when I entered, and every face broke into the kind of smile reserved for old friends. "Well, look here," said a driver in a vintage Western shirt. "We got ourselves a newcomer." He gestured to an empty stool at the counter. "Come on in, honey. Coffee's always fresh, and the pie's the best you'll find on any highway." I sat down cautiously, still not sure what I'd stumbled into. The waitress, a woman who looked like she'd stepped off a 1950s calendar, poured me coffee in a thick ceramic mug. "First time through?" she asked with a knowing smile. I nodded, and she laughed. "They're always a little confused at first. Don't worry, you'll get used to it." "Used to what?" I asked, and the driver next to me chuckled. "Used to the way station, darling. This is where we all end up eventually. Every driver who ever loved the road more than anything else. Some of us have been here since the 50s. Others rolled in just last week. But we're all family here, all part of the same brotherhood." I looked around the diner with growing unease. These men looked solid, real, but there was something indefinably wrong about the whole scene. The lighting was too perfect, the colors too vivid, and everyone seemed just a little too happy. "I don't understand," I said. "This is just a rest area, right? I mean, I need to get back on the road. My husband's sleeping in the truck and we have a delivery to make." The waitress refilled my coffee cup with a sad smile. "Honey, I'm afraid there's something you need to understand about this place. The drivers who stop here, well, they're all drivers who never made it to their final destination. Highway accidents, heart attacks, jackknifed rigs. We've all got stories about how our last run ended. But the thing is, we loved the road so much that we couldn't let go. So we ended up here, in the place between the highway and whatever comes after." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're saying you're all dead?" A driver across the room nodded sadly. "Afraid so, little lady, but it's not so bad. We get to keep trucking in a way. This place has everything we need. Good food, good company, and stories that'll last forever. Some of us drive local routes around here, delivering supplies to other way stations. Others just rest and reminisce. It's not the worst afterlife a trucker could ask for." I stood up abruptly, knocking over my coffee cup. "This is crazy. I'm not dead. My husband is waiting for me in the truck. We have a schedule to keep." But even as I said it, I was remembering fragments that didn't quite fit together. The The strange compulsion to take the exit, the musical sound of my tires on the stone road, the fact that my CB radio had been silent for the past hour when it should have been crackling with driver chatter. "Sarah," said the waitress gently, and I froze. I hadn't told anyone my name. "I know this is hard to accept, but you need to think about what happened before you saw that exit sign. Really think. Was there ice on the road? A deer that ran out in front of you? Another vehicle that didn't see your signals?" The memories came flooding back in a rush that made me grab the counter for support. The elk that had bounded onto the highway in front of my rig. My desperate attempt to avoid it, jerking the wheel too hard to the left. The sickening moment when I felt the trailer start to jackknife. The sensation of rolling over and over while Tom screamed my name from the bunk. The final impact against the concrete barrier, and then silence. "Tom," I whispered. "What happened to Tom?" The driver in the western shirt put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Your husband survived, Sarah. Banged up pretty bad, but he'll heal. He's in a hospital in Portland right now, probably wondering why he lived when you didn't. That's the hardest part for the families, the randomness of it all." I sank back onto the stool, the full weight of realization crushing down on me. I was dead. The truck outside wasn't really my truck. It was some kind of spiritual echo, a representation of the life I'd lost. And this place, this impossible truck stop full of drivers from across the decades, was where I'd be spending eternity. "The good news," said the waitress, refilling my cup again, "is that you don't have to stay here forever if you don't want to. Some drivers move on to whatever comes next after they've had time to process everything. Others choose to stay and help newcomers adjust. And a few." She pointed to the window where I could see a driver climbing into one of the vintage rigs. "Keep making runs to other way stations, carrying messages between drivers who got separated by death but not by the bond of the road." I watched the vintage Peterbilt pull away from the curb, its exhaust stack gleaming in the neon light. As it disappeared into the darkness beyond the town limits, I realized I had a choice to make. I could accept my death and find my place in this strange community of highway ghosts, or I could keep fighting the reality of what had happened, probably driving myself mad in the process. The driver next to me seemed to read my thoughts. "Take your time deciding, Sarah. We've got nothing but time here, and every driver finds their own way to make peace with the end of their last run. Just remember, the road doesn't really end, it just changes direction." I'm still here in the way station 3 days later or 3 years. Time moves differently when you're dead. I've made some practice runs to other stops, carrying messages and supplies to drivers who've been separated from their loved ones by the accident of death. It's not the life I planned, but it's still a life of sorts, still connected to the highway that shaped who I was. Sometimes I see Tom in dreams, and I know he can feel my presence when he drives the routes we used to run together. The road connects us still, across the boundary between the living and the dead. And someday, when his own last run is finished, I'll be waiting here at the way station, ready to show him that love survives even the worst accidents, and that every highway eventually leads home. The hitcher who knew my name. I'm Danny Rodriguez, and I've been an owner-operator for 11 years now, running my own freightliner and taking whatever loads keep the bills paid. Times have been tough lately. Fuel costs eating into profits, insurance premiums climbing every year, and competition from the big fleets making it harder for independent drivers to survive. So when I saw the hitchhiker on the shoulder of Highway 460 in rural Virginia, thumb out in the classic pose, I did something I'd never done before in my career. I stopped. Company policy had always been strict about passengers, no hitchhikers, no exceptions. Insurance wouldn't cover injuries to unauthorized riders, and you never knew what kind of trouble someone might bring into your cab. But I wasn't driving for a company anymore. This was my truck, my decision, and the guy looked harmless enough. Middle-aged, clean clothes, carrying a small duffel bag that suggested a man down on his luck rather than a dangerous drifter. I pulled over and hit the air brakes, watching in my mirror as the man jogged toward the passenger door. He climbed up with the practiced ease of someone who'd ridden in trucks before, settling into the seat with a grateful sigh. "Much obliged, Danny," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Name's Frank. Frank Castellanos. Going to Richmond if you're headed that way." I shook his hand, but something cold settled in my stomach. "How'd you know my name?" I asked, studying his face more carefully. He was older than I'd initially thought, maybe 60, with deep lines around his eyes and graying hair that looked like it hadn't seen a barber in months. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp, and there was something familiar about his features that I couldn't place. Frank smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Lucky guess," he said. "You look like a Danny to me. Always been good at reading people." He gestured toward the road ahead. "Richmond's about 4 hours from here, isn't it? That'll give us plenty of time to talk." I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, but the unease was growing stronger. There were dozens of names he could have guessed: Mike, John, Steve, anything. But he'd gone straight to Danny, and he'd said it with the confidence of someone who already knew. "You been hitchhiking long?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation normal. "On and off for about 20 years, Frank replied, settling back in the seat like he owned it. "Funny thing about hitchhiking, you meet all kinds of people, drivers especially. They're usually pretty predictable. Take you, for example. I bet you're behind on your truck payment maybe 2 months. Insurance is killing you, and you're thinking about giving up the independent life, going back to driving for someone else." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. He was right about the truck payment, 60 days behind and counting. The insurance premium had gone up 30% this year, and I'd been seriously considering selling the rig and taking a company job. But those weren't things you could guess just by looking at someone. "You seem to know a lot about trucking for a hitchhiker," I said. Frank chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "I know a lot about a lot of things, Danny. For instance, I know about the accident you had 3 years ago. The one where you fell asleep at the wheel outside Amarillo. Rolled your previous truck, spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Lucky the other driver survived, though his family sued you into bankruptcy." The truck swerved slightly as my concentration broke. I'd never told anyone the full story of that accident. Not even my wife knew how close I'd come to killing someone. The insurance settlement had wiped out my savings, forced me to sell my house, destroyed my credit rating. It was the reason I was struggling now, the reason I was behind on payments and desperate enough to pick up hitchhikers. "Who are you?" I demanded, pulling into the slow lane as my hands began to shake. "How do you know about that?" Frank turned in his seat to face me fully, and in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windshield, I could see something that made my blood freeze. His face had changed. The features were sharper now, more defined, and I realized why he'd looked familiar. He looked like me. Not exactly, but close enough to be a relative. An older brother, maybe, or a father I'd never met. "I'm you, Danny," Frank said calmly. "Or rather, I'm who you become if you keep making the same choices you're making now. The drinking that you think nobody notices. The stimulants that help you drive longer than you should. The shortcuts you take with maintenance because you can't afford proper repairs. All of it leads to the same place, another accident worse than the first one." I wanted to argue, to deny what he was saying, but the words stuck in my throat, because he was right about all of it. The flask I kept hidden under the seat for the really bad days. The pills I bought from other drivers to stay awake when I was pushing too hard for deadlines. the way I'd been ignoring the sounds my engine was making because I couldn't afford a major repair. The next accident happens in 8 months, Frank continued, his voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting historical events. Highway 75 north of Dallas. You're running behind schedule, exhausted, and you've taken too many pills to stay alert. A school bus full of kids merges in front of you just as you black out. 43 children dead, and their blood on your hands forever. The images he described flashed through my mind with horrifying clarity. The yellow bus, the moment of realization, the screaming metal and silence that follows. "That's not going to happen," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "I'm careful. I follow the safety regulations." Frank laughed, and it was the sound of bitter experience. "You tell yourself that, but we both know it's not true. You're already planning to drive through the night to make your next delivery. You've got a bottle of energy pills in your shirt pocket and a half-empty flask under your seat. You're one bad day away from becoming a killer, Danny. Just like I was." I looked at him again, really looked, and saw the haunted expression that lurked behind his familiar features. "You're not really me," I said. "You can't be, that's impossible." Frank nodded sadly. "You're right. I'm not exactly you. I'm the ghost of the man you're going to become if you don't change course. I'm the version of Danny Rodriguez who killed those children, who spent 15 years in prison, who died alone in a cell with nothing but regret and the memory of yellow school buses." The truck was drifting toward the shoulder as I struggled to process what he was telling me. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Frank reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a photograph, a school picture of a young girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Her name was Emma Martinez. She was 7 years old and she loved horses and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She was the first child to die in the accident, and her face is the last thing I saw every night before I closed my eyes. I pulled over to the shoulder and put the truck in park, my hands shaking too badly to drive safely. This is insane. People don't meet their future selves. Ghosts don't hitchhike on highways. Frank tucked the photograph back into his bag and opened the passenger door. "Maybe not," he said, climbing down from the cab. "But sometimes the universe gives us second chances, opportunities to choose a different path. The question is whether you're smart enough to take the warning seriously." I watched him walk away in my mirrors, expecting him to turn back or disappear or do something supernatural. But he just kept walking down the shoulder until he was out of sight, leaving me alone with the sound of traffic and the weight of choices I hadn't made yet. I sat there for an hour, thinking about school buses and little girls who wanted to be veterinarians, about the pills in my pocket and the flask under my seat. When I finally started driving again, I took the next exit and found a truck stop with a payphone. I called my dispatcher and told him I was taking the truck out of service for maintenance. Then I called my wife and told her I was coming home, that I had some things to figure out. The flask went into a dumpster behind the truck stop, along with the pills and all the shortcuts I'd been taking with my life. I never saw Frank again, but I didn't need to. The message had been delivered, and I'd been smart enough to listen. 6 months later, I sold the truck and took a job with a reputable company that had strict safety standards and regular drug testing. It was less money, but it was honest work that let me sleep at night without dreaming about school buses. Sometimes, I wonder if Frank was real or just a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But it doesn't matter, because the choice was real, and the children who might have died because of my mistakes are still alive, still growing up to become veterinarians and teachers and whatever else they dream of being. And that's worth more than any amount of independence or profit I might have gained by staying on the path that led to tragedy. The road ahead is always uncertain, but some destinations are worth avoiding at any cost. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you meet someone who's willing to show you the way to turn around before it's too late. Cargo that never stayed secured. My name is Mike O'Connor, though most folks in the business know me as Freight Dog. I've been hauling specialized cargo for 16 years, the kind of stuff that requires extra care, special permits, and a driver who knows how to handle delicate loads. Antiques, artwork, custom machinery, things that can't be thrown around like regular freight. I take pride in my work, and I've never damaged a shipment or lost so much as a single item. At least not until I took the Whitmore estate job 3 weeks ago. The call came from a high-end moving company in Charleston, South Carolina. They needed someone to transport the contents of a historic mansion to a museum in Savannah. Furniture, paintings, personal effects, the kind of valuable items that require climate-controlled trailers and white glove service. The pay was exceptional, nearly triple my usual rate, which should have been my first warning. In this business, when someone's willing to pay that kind of money, there's usually a reason nobody else wants the job. The Whitmore mansion sat on the outskirts of Charleston like a monument to another era. All Gothic revival architecture and overgrown gardens that hadn't seen proper care in decades. The estate sale company had already cataloged everything, and the loading crew was professional and efficient. But there was something unsettling about the items themselves. Every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum already. Massive oak wardrobes carved with intricate designs, dining room sets that could seat 20, and bedroom furniture that seemed too large for modern houses. The strangest items were the personal effects. Trunks full of clothing from the 1920s and 1930s, still in perfect condition as if they'd been worn yesterday. Photograph albums filled with images of a family that looked prosperous and happy, at least in the earlier pictures. The later photographs showed the same people, but there was something different about their expressions, something haunted and desperate that made me uncomfortable to look at them for too long. Loading took most of the day, and by the time we finished, my 53-foot trailer was packed to capacity with the Whitmore family's legacy. The crew chief, a nervous man who kept checking his watch, handed me the manifest and delivery instructions. "Drive straight through to Savannah," he said. "Don't stop except for fuel, and whatever you do, don't open the trailer doors until you reach the museum." The insurance company was very specific about that. I'd been hauling freight long enough to know when something felt wrong, and this job set off every alarm bell in my head. But the money was too good to pass up, and I figured the worst thing that could happen was some antique furniture getting a few more scratches during transport. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. Dead wrong. The first sign of trouble came about 50 miles outside Charleston. I was cruising along I-95 at a steady 65 when I heard something shift in the trailer. Not unusual by itself, even the best secured cargo can settle during transport. But this sound was different, deliberate, like someone was rearranging furniture back there. I pulled over at the next truck stop and walked around the trailer, checking the seals and listening carefully. Everything was secure from the outside, and the sounds had stopped. 20 miles down the road, it happened again. This time, the shifting was accompanied by what sounded like footsteps, measured, deliberate steps like someone pacing back and forth inside the trailer. I grabbed my CB radio. "Any drivers southbound on 95, this is Freight Dog at mile marker 86. Anyone else hearing strange noises from their cargo tonight?" The responses were immediate and predictable. Jokes about talking freight and suggestions that I lay off the coffee. But the footsteps continued, growing more pronounced as the miles rolled by. They were joined by other sounds, furniture being dragged across the trailer floor, doors opening and closing, and what sounded disturbingly like voices having quiet conversations. I tried to convince myself it was just the natural settling of an old house's contents, wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. But I'd hauled enough antique furniture to know what that sounded like. And this wasn't it. By the time I reached the Georgia state line, the sounds had become impossible to ignore. The footsteps were constant now, multiple sets walking back and forth like people getting ready for a formal dinner party. I could hear the scrape of chairs being moved, the clink of what sounded like silverware, and underneath it all the low murmur of conversation that I couldn't quite make out, but that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop outside Brunswick, parked under the bright security lights, and walked around my trailer again. The sound stopped the moment I stepped out of the cab, as if whatever was inside knew I was listening. The trailer doors were still sealed, the cargo straps still tight, everything exactly as it should be. But the silence felt wrong too, expectant, like something holding its breath. Against every instinct and the specific instructions I'd been given, I broke the seal on the trailer doors. I had to know what was causing the disturbance, had to verify that my cargo was still secure. The doors swung open with their usual metallic groan, and I shined my flashlight into the trailer's depths. The furniture had been completely rearranged. The dining room set, which had been loaded near the front and strapped down securely, was now arranged in the center of the trailer as if set for a formal meal. The chairs were positioned around the table with military precision, place settings of fine china and crystal laid out for 8 people. The massive wardrobe that had required a forklift to load was now standing upright against the trailer wall, its doors open to reveal clothing hanging neatly as if in an active closet. But it was the photographs that made my hands shake as I held the flashlight. The family albums that had been packed in boxes were now open and displayed around the improvised dining room, and the people in the pictures seemed to be looking directly at me. More disturbing still, there were additional photographs that I was certain hadn't been there during loading. Pictures of the same family, but taken in what appeared to be the back of a moving truck, sitting around the same dining room table that now dominated my trailer. I backed away from the trailer, fumbling for my cell phone to call the estate company. But before I could dial, I heard voices coming from inside, clear, distinct conversation that sounded like a family gathering. "Michael's here," said a woman's voice, warm and welcoming. "We've been waiting for you to join us for dinner." A man's voice, authoritative and kind, added, "Please don't be afraid. We know this is unusual, but we've been separated from our belongings for so long. We just want to be together again, to have one more family dinner in the home we've missed so much." I looked into the trailer again, and this time I could see them. Translucent figures seated around the dining table, dressed in the formal wear from the 1930s photographs. They were solid enough to cast shadows in my flashlight beam, real enough that I could see the love and longing in their faces as they looked at their restored possessions. The woman who had spoken first, elegant in a beaded dress that caught the light like stars, gestured to an empty chair at the table. "The Whitmore family has been waiting 70 years to sit down together again," she said. "When the house was sold and our things scattered, we thought we'd lost each other forever. But now, thanks to you, we're all here. Please, won't you stay for dinner? It's the least we can do to thank the man who brought us home." I understood then why the estate company had paid so much, why they'd insisted on white glove service and climate control. This wasn't just about transporting antique furniture. It was about reuniting a family that had been separated by death but bound together by their love for the possessions that held their memories. The Whitmores had died in their mansion during the 1930s, victims of a house fire that destroyed their bodies but somehow left their spirits attached to the things they'd cherished in life. I spent the next hour in that trailer listening to stories about the Whitmore family's life in Charleston, their business ventures, their children's accomplishments, and their love for the home they'd built together. They showed me family heirlooms and explained the significance of pieces that I'd thought were just valuable antiques. Every item in that trailer held a memory, a connection to lives that had been cut short but not forgotten. When it was time to leave, Mr. Whitmore shook my hand with fingers that felt like cool morning air. "We'll be quiet for the rest of the journey," he promised. We just needed to be together again, to remember what it felt like to be a family. "The museum will take good care of our things and we'll be able to stay with them there. It's not the same as our old home, but it's better than being scattered across different estate sales and auction houses." The rest of the drive to Savannah passed in complete silence. When I opened the trailer at the museum, everything was exactly as it had been loaded in Charleston. Secured properly, arranged logically, showing no sign of the supernatural dinner party that had taken place somewhere between Brunswick and my destination. The museum staff unloaded everything efficiently, commenting on the excellent condition of the pieces and the care with which they'd been transported. I still haul specialized cargo, but I'm more careful now about asking questions before I take a job. Some loads carry more than just monetary value. They carry the dreams and memories and unfinished business of people who can't quite let go of the things that made their lives meaningful. And sometimes, if you listen carefully while you're driving through the night, you can hear those stories being told in the darkness behind you. Families reuniting with the possessions that connect them across the boundary between life and death. The road is full of cargo that's worth more than its insurance value, and drivers like me are just the delivery service that helps lost souls find their way back to the things they loved most in life. The long haul that never ended, they call me Crossroads. Jim Patterson and I've been driving these highways for 31 years. I've seen every mile marker from Maine to California, hauled everything from fresh produce to heavy machinery, and collected enough stories to fill a library. But the run I'm on now, the one I started 6 months ago, is different from any load I've ever carried. Because 6 months ago I accepted a delivery that I'm beginning to think will never end. It started like any other job. My dispatcher called with a routine cross-country haul, automotive parts from Detroit to Los Angeles, good money for a standard route I'd driven dozens of times before. The pickup went smoothly, the paperwork was in order, and I had 72 hours to make the delivery. Plenty of time, even allowing for mandatory rest stops and the inevitable delays that come with driving 2,400 miles across the continent. I pulled out of Detroit at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, my Peterbilt loaded with 40,000 pounds of transmission components and running gear. The route was familiar, I-94 west through Michigan, I-80 across Illinois and Iowa, then south on I-76 through Colorado before picking up I-70 to California. I'd made this exact run so many times I could probably drive it in my sleep, which is why it took me several hours to notice that something was wrong. The first sign was subtle. I'd been driving for about 4 hours when I passed a distinctive truck stop near the Illinois-Indiana border, a place called Murphy's with a giant coffee cup sign that had been a landmark for truckers since the 1960s. Nothing unusual about that, except that I'd passed the same truck stop 2 hours earlier. At first, I figured I was just confusing it with another Murphy's location. The chain had dozens of stops across the Midwest, and after 3 decades of driving, they all started to look alike. But then I passed the same overturned car on the shoulder, the same construction zone with the same orange barrels arranged in the same pattern, the same billboard advertising a casino that was supposedly just 50 miles ahead. I grabbed my CB radio and called out, "Any eastbound drivers, this is Crossroads Jim on I-94. Can someone give me a location check? I think my GPS might be malfunctioning." The response was immediate. Crossroads Gym. You're at mile marker 127, about 15 miles east of Kalamazoo. But according to my trip log, I should have been approaching the Iowa border by then. I'd been driving for 6 hours at highway speeds, yet somehow I was only 200 miles from my starting point. I pulled over at the next truck stop and checked my paperwork, my route plan, my fuel receipts. Everything indicated that I'd been making normal progress, but the mile markers told a different story. I called my dispatcher from a payphone outside the truck stop. "Hey Charlie, this is Jim. I think I'm having some kind of navigation problem. Can you verify my current location?" There was a pause, then Charlie's familiar voice. "According to our tracking system, you're right where you should be, Jim." "Making good time, actually. ETA Los Angeles is still Thursday afternoon." But I wasn't making good time. I was trapped in some kind of loop, covering the same stretch of highway over and over again while my logbook and fuel gauge suggested I was making normal progress across the country. I tried taking different routes, exiting onto state highways, following alternate interstates, even driving backwards for several miles to see if I could break whatever pattern had captured me. Nothing worked. No matter which road I took, no matter which direction I drove, I always ended up back on the same stretch of I-94, passing the same landmarks in the same order. That's when I started noticing the other trucks. At first, they were just part of the normal traffic flow, and other drivers making their own runs, heading to their own destinations. But after several days of driving the same endless loop, I began to recognize specific vehicles. A red Kenworth with Nebraska plates that always seemed to be about 2 miles ahead of me. A blue Freightliner pulling a refrigerated trailer that I passed every few hours but never seemed to get ahead of permanently. An old Mack truck with faded paint that appeared in my mirrors at regular intervals, maintaining the same distance no matter how I adjusted my speed. I started trying to contact these other drivers on the CB. "Red Kenworth with Nebraska plates, this is Crossroads Jim. Come back if you copy." The response, when it came, was more disturbing than the silence would have been. "Copy, Crossroads Jim. This is Nebraska Bill. How long you been running this route?" "About a week now," I replied. "You?" There was a long pause before Nebraska Bill came back. "Hard to say exactly. Time gets funny when you're stuck in the loop. Could be a month, could be a year. Started to blend together after the first few cycles. That's how I learned about the others, drivers who, like me, had accepted routine loads and found themselves trapped on highways that went nowhere, carrying cargo to destinations they could never reach. We formed our own informal convoy, checking in with each other on the CB, sharing supplies when we stopped at the truck stops that appeared and disappeared along our endless route. There was Nebraska Bill, who'd been hauling grain to Denver when he got caught in the loop. Desert Rose, a female driver who'd been carrying electronics to Phoenix and hadn't seen her family in what felt like years. Iron Mike, a veteran driver who'd been transporting construction equipment to Seattle and had started marking the passing days by scratching lines into his dashboard. We were all running different routes to different cities, but somehow we were all trapped on the same impossible highway that led everywhere and nowhere. The truck stops along our route were staffed by people who seemed to understand our situation but couldn't explain it. They accepted our fuel cards, served us coffee and hot meals, and maintained the facilities as if everything was normal. But when we asked about the outside world, about our families and dispatchers and delivery schedules, they just smiled sadly and suggested we focus on the road ahead. Some drivers choose to stay. The waitress at the mile 127 truck stop told me during one of my regular stops. They find peace in the routine, in the community of other drivers who understand what they're going through. Others keep looking for the exit, the way back to the world they came from. Both choices are valid. I've been searching for that exit for 6 months now, or what feels like 6 months. Time moves strangely when you're driving the same highway day after day, seeing the same sunrise and sunset, passing the same landmarks in an endless cycle. My logbook shows that I should have reached Los Angeles months ago, but my truck's odometer suggests I've driven nearly 100,000 miles without ever leaving this stretch of interstate. The strangest part is that I'm not sure I want to find the exit anymore. The other drivers have become family, bound together by our shared experience of highways that exist outside normal space and time. We take care of each other, share stories and supplies, and find comfort in the certainty of our endless routine. There's something to be said for a life without destinations, where the journey truly is more important than arriving anywhere. Sometimes late at night when the CB is quiet and the road stretches empty in both directions, I wonder if this is some kind of purgatory for truckers who love the road more than anything else in their lives. Maybe we're all dead, killed in accidents we don't remember, and this is our eternity, driving forever on highways that never end, carrying loads that never need to be delivered. But if that's true, I think I'm okay with it. The road was always my home anyway, and now I have all the time in the world to explore every mile of it. Yesterday, or maybe it was last month, I passed a sign that read "Exit 1 mile, return to previous life." I slowed down, considered taking that exit, thought about the world I'd left behind. Then I saw Nebraska Bill in my mirror, and Desert Rose on the CB asking if anyone wanted to convoy through the night, and Iron Mike sharing stories about the loads he used to haul before he found this place. And I realized that some destinations are worth reaching, even if it means never arriving anywhere else. The long haul continues, and maybe it always will. But I'm not driving alone anymore, and that makes all the difference on a highway that stretches beyond the edges of any map.